All right, if we could all sit down again. We're about to start our fourth panel on politics and governance. It should be very interesting. My name's Johanna. I'm a member of the Stanford team, and I'm here to introduce you to this panel's moderator, Zach Levine. So Zach is a fellow from the 2014 AMENDS Summit, and he is the president of a virtual exchange organization called Dorm Room Diplomacy. This organization, through video conference dialogue, has connected students from more than 40 universities in 15 countries throughout the West and the Middle East to broaden perspectives. And so, without any further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Zach. Let's welcome him.
Hello, everyone. I am very excited and humbled to be moderating this panel today. We have a great cast of panelists, so let me get right to it and introduce them. Our first panelist today is Samir Khan from Oman. Samir is a PhD student and in 2009 founded an organization called Keynovations, which sprouted up from a self-charging battery startup. And he also is a consultant for the UNDP, the UNEP, as well as the founder of ASIC, which is another NGO. So let's welcome Samir. So before I let the panelists go ahead and discuss themselves a little bit, I just want to let everyone know within the general topic of today's discussion, which is policy and governance, our panel has decided to focus in a little bit more specific on turning advocacy into law, particularly in regard to civil society engagement in the policymaking process. So they're going to all talk about their experiences in civil society in their respective countries, or in Hanan's case, her work with the country she specializes in. So first, I'd like to invite Samir to share a few words about some of the work that he's done and how he made it here to coach.
Myself, Samir Khan, an engineer by education, but I've worked in the fields of sustainable development, education, human rights, policymaking around my past 8 years. With respect to what we are doing, we are providing a platform for individuals, organizations, and countries towards revolutionizing the policy-making mechanism by involving youth voice. So youth voice integration is the process towards actually achieving a proper policy. When we talk about governance, everyone has a problem with respect to democracy. They're like, our voice is not involved towards the final policy, which is being decided by a government. So we are bringing and bridging these gaps together towards an actual policy-making mechanism. And we have succeeded it to a large extent with respect to support from UN. We are currently in the advisory board for the UNDP for civil societies and various other organizations as well. But today, the main thing which I'll be emphasizing on is Oman, a country where there is no democracy, but still, in the policy-making mechanism, youth voice is integrated. So that's what I'll be putting an emphasis on.
So the first question I have for all of you is to just get a little bit of background on your respective countries. And I want to ask you about the policy-making processes in Oman, in Tunisia, in Morocco, as well as if you want to discuss Yemen, that would be fantastic. And particularly focusing on the role of civil society organizations within policymaking, and try to keep your answers quite brief so we can move on to the meat and potatoes of the next few questions.
As I had closed my opening remark with, we do not have a democratic model in the country, but still we have a policy-making mechanism which involves the integration of people's voice. Now, how does that happen? It's through the Shura Council. It's a council where it's like the lower level of the parliament, which are elected through elections. Like there's a proper election happening over there. Individuals from their respective communities stand up for the election. Now, how does this thing work with respect to policy making? So the final decision maker of any policy in the country is His Majesty Sultan Qaboos bin Said, who is the ruler of the country. So if there's a grievance or a problem or an amendment required in a policy with respect to any of the fields of the country, so individuals can inform to the Shura Council in their community with respect to what is required. Now the Shura Council will proceed forward with the proposal, if required, to the higher level of the parliaments. And this goes to the ministers and then finally to the ruler of the country. So there are different hierarchy levels maintained over here with respect to how a policy can be amended and how a policy can be developed. So in a simple way, we do not require political parties over here, and it has been working really functionally since past 42 years and plus, and people are in a very happy situation. There's a harmony with respect to how the country is going. So that is a paradigm shift of how we perceive democracy in our country.
Talking about Tunisia is a very complicated case, actually, because in the post-revolution period, there is a huge dynamic and very fast changing is taking place now in Tunisia, especially in terms of governance, public policy, and as you may know, that in the post-revolution period, like 3 governments were succeeded in Tunisia, and now we are having another government. So the unstable political scene in Tunisia had made kind of there is no long-term strategy in terms of public policy implemented by the government. So, but during the last elections, when we elected the new parliament and new president and new government was emerged from them, we are somehow working toward toward establishing a national-wide public policy and governance strategy. However, the things that we have been talking and discussing with politicians and with decision makers in Tunisia was only rhetoric. But the good thing that if you are advocating for something, or you are somehow lobbying to the government and you are advocating for a specific public policy and and some laws, the good thing that the Tunisian government and the authorities are responding, because they got elected in a transparent and fair elections. Because if I am electing you, and if you don't make keep the promises that you have made, you will lose the next elections, and this is the case for some political parties in Tunisia during the first elections. So here comes the role of civil society in Tunisia and the international institutions. And by the way, they are doing great, the international community and civil society organizations. However, the new culture of civic engagement through public policy and governance is not like very spread, because we didn't have, like, even now we don't have a lot of think tanks institutes in Tunisia, and like in Washington D.C. or in other many places. So there are only also few associations or NGOs working in that field. That's why we need more mobilizing and raising the awareness about the importance of public policy and governance, especially that many Tunisians think that we already held the parliamentary and presidential elections and that's it. But we have more important elections, the local institution elections. We are having in 2016 municipal elections that will make kind of changing the life of the citizen, because it's more close to him. So that's why now we have somehow to increase our advocacy and to make higher contributions toward public policy and governance, because
Thank you, Amir. I need to cut you off.
Yeah, thank you.
To get through the rest. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, you heard the set of challenges that the 2 colleagues here mentioned. Now imagine both of them combined. Let me explain. Morocco shares with Tunisia the fact that we share with Tunisia the fact that we were both colonized by France. So our laws pre-independence and post-independence are very much influenced by Paris. The second thing we share with Tunisia is that we are, at the end of the day, a Muslim majority country. So a lot of our laws are also influenced by Sharia law. Now, the third complicating component is that something we share with Oman, we have a king, or in their case, a sultan. So the king can introduce laws just by royal decree. So here you have 3 major forces that kind of are trying to shape the different legislations and different penal codes in Morocco. And at points, it's really hard to find which channel to best follow if you want to actually enact a certain change. We were lucky, at least after the new king took oath in 1999, because he was a reformist. we saw that like the civil society had a far greater say in what kind of laws were introduced, what kind of laws were adopted. In fact, most of the laws today are suggested and put to the table by the civil society. We have the Mudawana, which is the legislation taking care of the family, especially women and different various aspects of the nucleus of the community and society. And these legislations are suggested or at least advocated for by different women NGOs and also civil NGOs. In fact, they managed to get a petition with 1 million signatures to push the government to strike down an amendment that was in one of our laws. We also had seen like great leaps forward by women organizations in Morocco that have managed to revolutionize women legislation. I'll give you an example. Back in Morocco, just a couple of years ago, a guy could rape a girl, and in order to avoid jail, he could just marry her. That was it, the end of the story. Now imagine how cruel this is. Thanks to a couple of women-led NGOs, this has been changed because there was a wide petition. There was a huge pressure from civil society to get the government and also the king, by implication, to take an active stance. So these couple of years, we have a very strong civil society involvement in the policymaking process, and this is just getting stronger and stronger by the day.
Great,
because
thank you. Yeah, move on.
I'll be very brief. My experience is, of course, secondhand because I don't actually operate in the countries in which our partners do, but my experience is secondhand from them. Suffice it to say that this, regardless of all the differences, civil society plays the same important role of, like I said previously, bridging the gap between engaged citizenry and their governments and policymakers. In Yemen in particular, maybe unlike other parts of the Middle East and North Africa, there is actually a relatively long history of this kind of work, and Yemeni civil society has numerous examples of successful implementation of advocacy strategies through the use of coalition building, often using religious institutions or tribal networks to build a kind of grassroots support for the policy changes that they would like to see and delivering them through those appropriate channels to government to impact change.
Thank you, guys. In addition, Anan, I know that you focus, in addition to Yemen, also on Libya and Egypt. And so since we had the Tunisian perspective, the Moroccan perspective, do you mind just doing a quick compare and contrast to the civil society landscape in Egypt and Libya to what you heard from your colleagues?
Egypt, also like Yemen, has an older history of civil society. Unfortunately, that's been a little bit more restrained due to the political landscape in Egypt and the various threats to democracy and freedom of expression there. It does make the environment a lot more challenging for civil society. That said, civil society is very vibrant and they do everything they can in terms of monitoring government and relaying that information to to the public. On the question of whether or not they've had a lot of success in terms of using advocacy to affect policy change, I can't especially say, but from my experience, that's been relatively limited compared to other parts of, or at least compared to Yemen, for example. In Libya, civil society is very young. It didn't really exist before the revolution. It's definitely one of the most energetic civil society scenes I've ever come across. And that's kind of what keeps our faith and our hope going for Libya, because despite all the challenges and threats that they face, they are very, very vibrant and very enthusiastic, and it always brings me hope when I go and see them. So.
Fantastic, thank you. I'd like to open it up to questions. You have a microphone?
Is it working?
Yes, sir.
Thank you so much, Zach, and the panelists. Thank you so much for your inspiring work and your initiatives. And I would like to have the chance to thank the coach team for bringing, making this possible, and everyone who actually contributed to this. I have a question for the panelists, and my question might be a little bit loaded. From your experience, how threatened or insecure the policymakers or the government you're working with are and how you deal with that. How do you take it from there? So any one of you feel free to answer. And if you have any specific examples, I would like you to share it with the audience. Thank you.
Anyone want to take it?
Well, let's talk about a scenario of our country where civil society organizations are not allowed, where NGOs are not allowed to be established. So how does things work out over there? So we have Tawasul, which is an organization established by the government, which is a not-profit. So that is one way. Now, okay, there's one organization, but what about the other entities, other regions? One organization cannot reach everywhere. So there's a workaround in that. That is student body and student councils in respective universities. So now, in this scenario, what happens is a student council can come up with projects with respect to like whatever problem they have, and then proceed forward towards policy and various issues which they want to create an awareness upon. Now, with respect to like a scenario where it was really difficult or it was really huge to target the audience, it was a project by the United Nations which we were working on. It was on the World We Want 2015 forum, where we had to capitalize all the private sector industries together, and the youth as well, and the government, and what was their perspective on environmental sustainability and how we can make changes on the policy. And that was like, okay, we have so many industries, they have their governance policy with respect to recruitment, with respect to CSR, with respect to environment, with respect to everything related to governance. Then there are youth who have their vision towards these companies and how they perceive their community. And then we have the government itself with respect to how they perceive these companies and the youth and employment. So we created this common platform online with the support from UN on the World 2015 Forum, and it was a common gathering of everyone together, and we could discuss on a common platform. And that was like marginalizing the gaps between all these things together. So we overcame a lot of issues with respect to this.
Excellent. We have a lot of questions, so we'll let you tackle the next one. Rachel? And then afterwards, squeeze you in.
You touched on this a bit, but I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the leverage that international NGOs or international players play in either uplifting grassroots civil society initiatives or influencing policy, or perhaps the opposite, the negative effects that come with that. So maybe looking really briefly at some of the positive things that either the UN or other multilateral agencies bring to the table, but also potentially some of the repercussions of that.
Actually, I would love to respond to your question. Can I? So, concerning about the international community work in many countries, especially that the Arab Spring countries like Indonesia, after Ben Ali left or escaped to Saudi Arabia, about a week, like many international organizations rent some offices and they get headquartered in Tunis. So the international community, especially in the transition period, they are very, very interested in the transition period because it's very interesting, you know. But however, in the post-transition period, maybe even the donors, even the international organization will leave the country soon. This is what I am anticipating. That's why talking about the threats from the government, in a way to ensure sustainability, you have to ensure capacity building of civil society organizations through making networking, through advocating, and especially through ensuring that these civil society organizations are strong enough to stand for their for gender issues, for accountability, and to ensure that all the community, like governments, authorities, NGOs, international NGOs, all focusing on implementing a good strategy for public policy and for governance in a way to ensure democracy.
And how are they doing in Tunisia? How are they doing in Tunisia?
Actually, in Tunisia, there are many projects, like International Republican Institute now is having a project on political accountability, and this is very interesting. Like, they want to ensure, especially that there is somehow an international pressure. Like, if you are dealing with political parties, it would be better to have an international partner to have some kind of credibility in a way. But in the future, as I said, through capacity building, through networking, through lobbying and advocacy, we will have like more impact and higher contributions. Thanks.
My question is for Hanan regarding the Egyptian case, of course. Currently, I'm curious about the practicality of what can happen in Egypt, especially that I think we are in a phase that related to spirit burning, like activists are in jail, media is being controlled, and we do not have a policy mechanism to lobby it because we do not have any parliament. We have even a new capital that's being constructed without any citizen being included in the decision. So I need to know what kind of capacity building people can like go for it to handle this kind of complicated situation, because people end up just discharging whatever they have as an initiative in social media, which is, let's say, not really helping. So I need to know about what kind of practicality in capacity buildings that can help in this kind of situation.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about the way you characterize the context in Egypt. And you're absolutely right that practicality is a big question, and it's one that we struggle with in terms of our work with civil society in Egypt as well. But I think it's important for us to continue to, all of us in Egypt as well as the international community, to continue to lay the foundations for this kind of inclusive, free, democratic society that we would all like to see in Egypt. And I think one way of doing that is in building the capacity among civil society organizations, one piece at a time. And so we start with the basic bricks of how to write persuasive policy briefs, for example, how to phrase your arguments in such a way that it makes it more appealing to a policymaker should you be able to deliver it to someone who can actually make that change, how to map out stakeholders and people who can influence change in a way that is appropriate for the context that you're in. You're right, there isn't a parliament currently in Egypt, but there are other mechanisms that people can use, informal mechanisms that we've seen people use in the Middle East and North Africa, even before the revolutions. And so getting people to think about ways that they can deliver those policy recommendations and those changes that they would like to see in the way that is appropriate for their context is one way we can do that. At the same time, we continue to build and develop the advocacy skill set that people have, and we continue to think about in the future, when the future is brighter, how do we actually play this out in a freer setting? And so in building those capacities now, we lay the groundwork for a future Egypt that is very different than the one we see today. And in doing it with one civil society organization at a time, I think they begin to play a role in educating the wider public and developing this kind of more mature rhetoric so that people aren't just saying everything they think on television without necessarily having evidence-based thinking behind it.
We'll take one last question. I believe Jessica had her hand up last time. For Mohammed, we could have him fight for the question.
Mohammed, you talked a lot about channeling youth energies from, you said throwing rocks, or what it sounded like was violent resistance, and channeling that energy into advocacy work, which in a way sounds a little bit like silencing dissent. So my first question is, do you see no worth in violent resistance towards the state in Morocco or elsewhere? And my second question is, can you really have democracy with a king? Just to get at the root of the problems.
She gave you some softballs there.
Well, to jump quick to your second question, I don't believe there's democracy with a king. So this is like my clear stance. And one should not be able to decree royal legislation just because of his bloodline or because he's been appointed to a certain position. So I'm clear on that. The second question, the first comment, I mean, it's understandable that like sometimes forced rebellion or armed struggle is necessary in some cases, especially in cases where you don't have institutions, where the only way to channel your opinions or to establish your positions is by throwing rocks. I mean, like the case of Palestine is a clear example of that. The case in Morocco is somewhat different because we already have institutions that, although not functioning very well, can still be a vehicle through which you can pass legislation or at least expose your ideas to policy makers and stakeholders. Maybe they're not going to act upon it, but at least it's creating a culture of lobbying and active engagement in policymaking. In the United States, it's very apparent. Like on campuses, in DC, you can feel that young people are involved. They call their senators, reach out to the office of their congressmen, and they're trying to petition for their own ideas to be discussed at least. In Morocco, we're trying to do the same. Maybe this is not something, a project for a year, maybe a decade, or maybe a century, but at least this journey of 1,000 miles starts with one step, I guess.
I'd like to give a big round of applause for our panelists. I believe we have a much needed coffee and cookie break right